Suzanne, I've really been
All
looking
right.
forward to this next session.
I know you have.
When we had our last principals meeting, one of the questions that came up was, what are we missing? So we've created this new segment called the wild card. And as you mentioned earlier today, we wanted to invite a guest who would challenge conventional wisdom and help us see what we might be missing in cyber. We both came up with the same name independently, which I think, as you mentioned earlier, is pretty remarkable. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Thomas Ridd to the Cyber Initiatives Group virtual studio. I think many of you know Thomas. He's the founding director at the Alperovich Institute for Cybersecurity Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His 2020 book called Active Measures was a history of disinformation and was translated into 7 languages. And I actually reviewed that book for the Cipher Brief.
That's right, you did. His 2016 book before that was called Rise of the Machines, and it tells the story of how cybernetics, a late 1940s theory of machines, came to incite both anarchy and war. He also had a 2015 article attributing cyber attacks that was designed to explain, guide, and improve the identification of network breaches. And then in 2013, he published the much cited Cyber War Will Not Take Place.
So Thomas, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Is my video working? I enabled it on my end, but it's not coming through.
I don't see you.
Well,
yeah,
I'm sharing my webcam.
It looks like it should be working, but it's not. The one thing I could suggest, Thomas, if you want to do, is log out and log back in very quickly. It's what we call around here the Cipher Brief reboot. It sometimes works, and it doesn't take too long. So Rick and I can do a little tap dance if you want to give that a shot. Otherwise, we do have your bio up on the screen. So
and if you have an external camera, make sure that's enabled.
It is, everything's enabled. I just tested it, but let's do a quick reboot. Sorry for the glitch.
All right, let's do that. No problem. No problem. Rick and I will entertain while Thomas logs back in. I do think, doing this segment is one of my favorite things because I get criticized sometimes for having this wild imagination and I'm writing a novel and doing these other things, but there's this whole idea that Hollywood, the creative thinkers out there are the ones who are able to really kind of anticipate what's coming that we're not thinking through because we're so focused on the day-to-day and making sure that we're dealing with the issues of the day, whether it's ransomware or something else. So I love the idea of bringing in people, Rick, that are going to challenge us. And the Pentagon has done this for years. I think the IC, parts of the IC have done this, where they bring in people who know nothing about the subject to really kind of help troubleshoot. Well, fortunately, in this case, Thomas knows a lot about the subject, but he's also been sort of on the leading edge of anticipating where things are going. So I don't think there are enough opportunities to bring that thought in. And we have you back. And look, the Cipher Brief reboot worked. I'm just going to say.
Yeah, it turns out the wrong camp. Thank you so much again.
Our wild card today. As Suzanne mentioned, we both wanted to hear from someone who could really challenge us to think differently. And so what do you think we're missing when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm humbled, and humbled also by the lineup, and that you think I could add much to the attractiveness of this event by being a surprise guest. So I will try. What are we missing? I think when I teach, term has just started, and when I teach, and I'm not teaching in a degree that combines cybersecurity studies with intelligence history and really intelligence studies writ large. And I think if I reapproach cybersecurity in terms of the big picture, which by definition you have to do when you teach an intro level class to graduate students, and many of my graduate students or our graduate students have experience in this space already, and they also appreciate the fresh take. Then I think a lot of the activity that we see today effectively falls into a counterintelligence paradigm. And I know that's very unusual to look at exposures of, adversaries, APTs, and sometimes exposure of US or Five Eyes capabilities through a counterintelligence lens. But I think effectively, although oftentimes these disclosures and revelations are handled and generated by the private sector, and if the government is involved, it's often not under counterintelligence authorities. In effect, I think it's a very helpful mindset to start thinking about what's really going on. Because if we take that counterintelligence mindset, then I think it comes into sharper relief that what we've seen since 2012, when the threat intelligence community in the private sector really started to mature, 2011 maybe, when some of you may remember Shady Rat and Dmitry Alperovich's role in exposing that, and the Citizen Lab just before that with the Chinese operations against Tibetan individuals. And then later, of course, the famous APT-1 report by Mandiant, and so on. So what we've seen in the interim is really a maturation of this attribution conversation, and really pretty innovative tactical approaches to exposing intelligence operations. Sometimes exposing intelligence operations in a way that doesn't require you to know who you are exposing, which is really quite extraordinary if you think about it. You can expose an APT actor with a funny, private sector cryptonym named after some animal because you have a suspicion that it could be a certain country, or just named after a number, like Mandiant used to or still does. And you're tracking an entity, it's an advanced actor, an intelligence agency, most likely. And at some point you start burning their capabilities collectively with others, sometimes in cooperation with the government, sometimes in cooperation with other firms. That is really, if you think in the bigger historical picture, a truly extraordinary historical development, that we have this really vibrant alternative counterintelligence community out there that is now coming up with some pretty outside the box tactics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether that resonates, so I'll just stop here and wait for questions.
Yeah, I kind of want to hear Rick's question because you talked about sort of out of the box tactics, and I think Rick's got great experience dealing with that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Thomas. I do get the cybersecurity as counterintelligence thing, especially when you're talking about nation states. Probably less applicable against criminals and ransomware and things like that, but certainly against nation states. And again, according to the press, some of that was done with the 2018 midterm elections, where Cyber Command was out forward and they discovered adversary tools and immediately reported them up to Virus Total, and now the tools are basically dead to anyone who updates their AV software.
So the example that you're highlighting there, Rick, I think is fascinating. Not just the midterm election context, but writ large, the Cybercom's initiative to, with an impressive regularity, upload specific indicators and samples to Virus Total. Can you still hear me? I don't know what's going on here.
We lost your camera. We can still hear you though.
But keep talking.
Okay, so I apologize for that. It shouldn't have happened. With impressive regularity, Cybercom has exposed adversary operations, sometimes without attribution and oftentimes with attribution. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating about this is that ultimately these revelations, there are other tactics, and I'm just going to highlight, I'm going there now, I'm just going to highlight other operations or phenomena that we see. So for example, many in the cybersecurity community, threat intelligence community, will be familiar with Intrusion Truth, an entity that regularly exposes the Chinese MSS operatives and operations. There's another entity that exposes MOIS, Iranian intelligence personnel, that is known under a Farsi name, Lab Dohtegan, also with great regularity. So, and of course, we have seen similar phenomena that are exposing Western, Five Eyes operations as well. And I think it's really important to look at that cat and mouse game between intelligence operations that take place, that evolve, that improve their tradecraft, and then at some point the exposing other side, who do attribution, sometimes indictment, sometimes covert revelations, also improving their tradecraft. And really, one of the interesting questions is, how is that capability distributed? Because it appears to me that some countries, can fairly easily purchase or contract out some collection operations, and sometimes even influence operations. But on the counterintelligence side, on the attribution side, if you like, the capabilities are much harder to acquire and much more subtle to develop, and a lot fewer countries actually have them at a sophisticated level.
Yeah, and certainly in the U.S., we've got some really excellent threat intel organizations. I remember back in 2012, I was running NSA's Cyber Threat Operations Centers, the NTOC. Actually, when I met Suzanne, she was working for CNN and came in and interviewed me, and we had engagements with Mandiant and other practitioners, and they were just starting, as you said, to get really good at that point. And in the years since, they've become phenomenal. They've actually, in some ways, gotten better than the government in that they can do things that the government can't easily do. And so they're able to do human and SIGINT, if you will, in a combined way that is really hard for the U.S. government to do.
Yeah. And oftentimes it appears to me have access to endpoints and victim networks or C2 networks that are located in the United States or in allied countries, which makes it a lot harder, I suspect, for the U.S. intelligence community to get involved quickly, at least. So I think, yeah, fascinating to see that collaboration effectively between different between different providers of intelligence. And also interesting to see that the evolution of how in the traditional IC, the recognition of private sector capabilities, I think rather slowly evolved, but I think it appears to me today that there's some respect now for the kind of work that is done in the private sector.
Yep, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think a big respect. I was just going to ask you a question, Thomas, which is, I always kind of look to your book titles to kind of figure out what you're thinking and what your next big thing is. Are you already plotting another one?
I'll keep that. The problem is when you write a book like Active Measures, which gets, thanks to Rick, by the way, in this context, very favorably reviewed by a lot of people and interesting places. It's a little terrifying in terms of writing the next book because I'm up against significant expectations at this stage. So I'm working on another big project, and it will be interesting. I think it's related to some of the things that I said just now. One thing that I think we're also missing is, I'll make two larger points. One is sort of not that provocative. The other one is a little more provocative, if you want me to go there. I'll start with a less provocative one. The one thing that I find really hard to handle as an academic, as a scholar, as a researcher working in this space is the extraordinary amount of source material, of primary source material that is not publicly available, but also not classified because it's not generated by the government. I'm talking about the whole proprietary space of reporting. TLP, traffic light protocol is often the sort of quasi-classification protocol that's used in this context. But the amount of reporting out there that I don't have access to because I really can't afford a subscription to many of these high-profile proprietary feeds is stunning. And I'm wondering, really, we don't know how the visibility into this space is really distributed. And the unevenness of that and the lack of access for people like myself who research this professionally in a non-profit fashion, that I think is a problem that doesn't receive enough attention. And also think about it from a sort of future historian's perspective. A lot of that knowledge will get lost very quickly. In fact, it's already getting lost because companies get acquired and their reports disappear from the internet. the internet actually does forget. And of course, some never make it out to the internet. So that's something I think we are missing, because we're really not talking about it enough, because it's a little removed from the news cycle.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the the companies need to keep the stuff quiet because it's basically the product that they sell. But maybe they could put a timer on it and say, after a year we'll make this more generally available.
Yeah, probably a year is not enough time, because oftentimes there are NDAs involved, and clients could become identified if you connect the dots, etc. So there are also private sector specific sensitivities. So, but I think 5 to 10 years is maybe a time frame that we could start talking about in that context. And in that context, I'll mention something else, which is more provocative, especially in this round. And that is, I think if we look at the history of the threat intelligence community, the private sector, the industry maturing in this space, I think that history is ultimately linked in ways that haven't been explored to some of the big leaks that we've seen in the mid-2010s and following years out of the US intelligence and allied intelligence communities. Sorry, I think I know how to fix this time. I don't know why my camera is doing this.
Keeping us guessing.
So the question here that I wanted to raise is, we're coming up to 10 years after Snowden, and many of these documents that the US government has never said anything about, never responded to, never put into context. And of course, researchers like myself take a close interest in these documents. And, of course, we can work with what's publicly known, but or has been released. But if we assume that adversaries, sophisticated adversaries, have had a chance to get their hands on these documents anyway, I'm not saying they should be publicly released, by the way, but maybe it is at some point in the future worth thinking about a way to make some of this material accessible, perhaps in a controlled fashion, to researchers, to academics that are, shall we say, sober-minded, and also perhaps even giving vetting and release authority to the appropriate agencies involved. But just letting time pass and not doing anything about the situation doesn't strike me as the best solution. And I'll just add a quick observation here from a teacher, from an educator's point of view. What is also quite disturbing, I find, in the classroom is that so many students, especially junior students, like younger people who don't have any experience yet, who would like to get a clearance, and maybe already have clearances, are sometimes, and I apologize for this video feed, I don't know what's happening here, but sometimes really rather terrified that they could come across leaked material in their reading and could endanger their future clearances. And as an educator who, of course, I don't have a clearance and I have no intention of ever getting one, so I'm working with everything that I can see, I also want to do the right thing vis-a-vis them. So it's putting me in a very difficult position in order to not, make my students uncomfortable, or potentially putting them in a difficult position down the line. So another conversation I think that we're missing.
So back to your previous conversation, actually, so there was two components to it. One, the second half was the Snowden material, for example. But the first part of that was you said that you thought there was a connection between the rise of private sector threat intel and those releases. Can you talk more about the connection? What makes you think that?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating question. I think there are multiple different connections. I'll just point out one that I even encountered in my own work. Some of the released files, some of the GCHQ material is even more interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. But of course, some NSA material is also very remarkable. But some of these presentations, for example, made it very easy for me to show to a journalist who didn't believe that attribution is possible, to show that journalist, okay, look at this operation. This is how NSA attributed a specific operation to 3PLA in detail, 4 steps or whatever. And And that was very helpful to have, really. And that's just one small example that applied to me. What applied to the threat intel space is I think that a lot of people who, and oftentimes they were outside the United States, were able to just, I mean, let's not put too fine a point on it. A lot of material that was leaked was really impressive in terms of the technical sophistication. One person I highly respect said that this was alien technology when it was developed, in terms of way ahead of the private sector. So I think it just showed the private sector the art of the possible, if you like, of what the advanced intelligence agencies are able to do, and then you could adjust some of your own capabilities.
Got it. Interesting.
Very good. Fascinating conversation. I think, Rick, do you have one more question? You want to close out?
I'm going to say that, Thomas, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, to be our mystery guest, and presenting us with some additional food for thought.
Thank you for having me, and I just want to reiterate that what I said there at the end was really meant in a cooperative and constructive spirit. I didn't mean to provoke for the sake of provocation.
Yeah,
I actually love that, because we do have to start thinking about this differently, which means we have to go into those provocative areas that are a little bit more difficult sometimes to navigate through. So
and I'll apologize for my instinctive reaction when you mentioned Mr. Snowden's name.
No, I often have the same reaction.
long history there, which we'll let people go Google and do their own research and figure out. All right, Thomas, thank you so much for being a great sport and for giving us these things to think about, and we'll definitely follow up with you as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Thomas.